All right. If you got your Bibles, go ahead and turn to Matthew chapter 5. And we're going to look at verse 33 through 42. Matthew chapter 5, verse 33 through 42. And while you're turning there, I'm going to ask you a question. I already know the answer, but I'm going to ask you anyway, okay? Have you ever... Well, let's see. I'll ask it this way. Have you ever heard the term white lie? Little white lie. Y'all ever heard that term, a little white lie? Oxford Dictionary, this is what it says for a little white lie. A harmless or trivial lie, especially one told to avoid hurting someone's feelings. All right, so an example would be if somebody gets a new haircut, and they're all excited, and they come up to you, and you look at it, and you're like, that's the worst haircut I've ever seen. And they ask you what you think of their haircut. And then you look at them, and you see the excitement on their face, and you say, oh, it's great. I like that. Little white lie. Guys, when your wife is trying something on and she puts it on and you're ready to go out, you're probably late because she's gone through different outfits, and then she finally settles on an outfit and she says, how does this look? See, I don't even have to finish that one because you already know how that one's going, right? And so you do the little white lie, right? It looks great, let's go. I might pay for that one later on, I'm thinking. So in this part of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, as we go through the Sermon on the Mount, he's going to address two things. One, he's going to address is truth. The second is he's going to address our actions, how we treat other people. So that's what we're going to look at. So that leads to our big idea. If you look on your listening guide, our big idea is your words and actions are a byproduct of your relationship with God. Your words and actions are a byproduct of your relationship with God. You ever thought about that? That the words you say, the actions you show is a byproduct of how your relationship with God's going? That's what we're going to look at this morning. So let's go ahead and get started. Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 33. Jesus said, again you have heard, the ancients were told, you shall not make false vows, but shall fulfill your vows to the Lord. But I say to you, make no oath at all, either by heaven But I say to you, make no oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is the footstool of his feet, or by Jerusalem, for it is the king, or the city of the great king. Nor shall you make an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. But let your statement be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything else beyond these is of evil. All right, so let's stop there and let's start going through this. And the first point on your listening guide is speak the truth in love. Speak the truth in love. All right, so Jesus starts to talk about telling the truth. Now, it used to be, I don't think it's that way now, that it used to be that a man's word was his bond. Do you agree with that? That a person said, I promise that I'm going to do this, then that meant you could trust, right? And you could even do it with a handshake, right? You shook on it after you said, I'm going to do this, and you'd shake on it. And there was no need for a contract or anything like that because your word was your bond. That's not the case nowadays, is it? Right? We have a lot of different contracts because people tend to break contracts, and you want to make sure that you're protected. Well, it's the same for Jesus' time back then also, is the religious leaders, they had developed this elaborate system of giving oaths to be able to create loopholes so that they could get out of doing something. Now you heard me right. The religious leaders had set this up so that they could do loopholes to get out. So they concluded if you made an oath for anything other than to God, then you could break it. Does that sound right? If you could make an oath to anything other than God, that you could break it. But if you broke it and it wasn't to God, then you wouldn't be liable to God. You would only just have broken your word, and that was basically it. So they were emphasizing that truth, when you were making an oath, the truth was that you made it to God, but nobody else. And that meant you would do it. But if you made it to something other than God, then you weren't held to it. Well, now, if we think about that for ourselves, we're kind of taught that too, are we not? Y'all were looking at me like, no, we're not taught that. Oh, yes, we are. Think about it. When you were kids, you were taught if you cross your fingers, what? It didn't count, right? And so people would stand behind their hands crossed behind them so that they could tell a lie, because as kids you were taught, well, if you cross your fingers and you promise something, it doesn't count because you had your fingers crossed. And then you would put them behind your back so nobody would see it, so that way they wouldn't know whether you are telling the truth or you're not telling the truth. So, were we taught the same thing? Yes. Unfortunately, we were, right? How many of y'all remember crossing your fingers as a kid as you were telling somebody you would do something, knowing good and well you weren't going to do that? We've all been there, right? Because we've all sinned. We've all fallen short of the glory of God. I tried to find out where this started, the finger crossing. Where in the world did this start? And I found an article, and this is a big maybe, but they said it was traced back to Christianity. And it was traced back basically that if they crossed their fingers while they were lying, they were protecting themselves from God's wrath because they were breaking one of the 10 commandments. And they made a cross in the shape of a cross, so they said that would help protect them from God's wrath. Kind of like, in the game of Monopoly, and you get one of those cards and it says, get out of jail free. And so that when you land in jail, all you have to do is produce the card, and then you get out of jail. That's the way they viewed it. They crossed their fingers, and that was to them their get out of jail free as far as God's wrath. And that God wouldn't have wrath on them for what they were saying. Is that true? No, right? It just makes us feel good about sinning, right? Because that's basically what's happening. We just find a way to make ourselves feel good so that we're not liable for when we do sin. When I was growing up, a friend and I, we used to make up stories to try to trick each other into believing something. And guys, we're gonna go up and say, look, I heard so-and-so likes you. And that she just wants you to go up and say hey to her, and then you go from there. And then he would believe it, and he would go up and he would talk to the girl, and then he'd come back and said, she has no interest in me. And I would look at him and start smiling. He said, you knew that all along, didn't you? I said, you got it, that's right. And he said, all right, you got one on me. So then he would come up and say, let me tell you about so-and-so. And I would hear it, and I'd believe it, and guess what? Nothing, right? And I'd come back. Yeah, I know. That's right. So we started doing this early on, so we had to get a system so that we would know whether we were telling the absolute truth or we were just trying to pull one over. And if it got to the point where we're like, wait a minute now, I'm not believing this. Our agreement was, we would say, are you promising me this on a stack of Bibles? Now, I don't know why we didn't just say one Bible. I guess we figured if we said a stack of Bibles, that meant that it was, that was really serious then. So we would always say, are you sure on a stack of Bibles you're telling me the truth right now? And that was like our test. And if I said, yeah, on a stack of Bibles, then he knew I was telling him the truth. Well, that's what was happening back then, is they were given their word and oaths, but they were doing it so that they could find loopholes to get around it. And Jesus gives us examples here of what they were doing, what they were swearing on. Let's go back again in verse 33, and it says, "And you have heard from the ancients that you shall not make false vows, but shall fulfill your vows to the Lord." Now they took this last part, "but you shall fulfill your vows to the Lord," and said you can only make them to God. When you make them to God, that's serious, but you can make vows to something other than God, and it's not as bad. And so he starts to give them to us. He says, "But I say to you, make no oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God." So they would make an oath to heaven saying, "I promise you by heaven that I will do this." Sounds good, right? But they said, "Well, it's not on God, so I can get away with it." And then they would skirt that. And then they said, "Or by the earth," God's creation. Again, they would skirt it. They would say, "No, for it is a footstool of his feet." Or by Jerusalem. They would say, "I promise this by Jerusalem." But then they would back out of it. But Jesus comes back and says, "For it is the city of the great king. And nor shall you make an oath by your own head." They would say, I've promised by my own head that I'll do it. I like what Jesus comes back with when he says this, "For you cannot make one hair white or black." And when I read this one this morning, a story came back to me. When I was 16 years old in high school, I was sitting in my desk and there was a girl behind me, and she looked at me and she said, "Do you have paint in your hair?" And I said, "No, not that I know of." She said, "Well, you got a white spot right there." And I said, "Well, I guess it must be paint." I go home and look, and it's gray hair that's already coming in. Y'all can tell it's already filled in now. I'm completely gray-headed. But at 16 years old, I'm like, oh no, I'm already turning gray. And I come to this verse and I'm like, man, I really wish I could turn my hair back black, but it's white, and that's the way it's going to stay. But Jesus was saying, basically, don't do oaths on something you know you're going to break. Your yeses should be yes, and your no's should be no. Look at verse 37. "But let your statement be yes for yes and no for no. Anything beyond this is evil." He's basically saying that when we say we're going to do it, then we're telling somebody we're going to do it. We don't need to make an oath to them. We can say, my word is good because I'm going to do it, and then we follow through with it. If we say we're not going to do it, then we don't do it. Basically, what he's telling us is that we should keep the truth. We should speak the truth, and we should keep the truth. And we don't break it. We don't go back on our words. If we're people of God, then that means that we are people of our word. And if we give somebody our word, then that means that we're going to follow through with it. And if something happens and we're not able to do it, that means we come clean and say, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to do this. I know I promised that I would, but I'm not going to be able to do this. Instead of letting them find out another way or letting them hear from somebody else, we just come clean with them. So that means that we should speak in truth. Now, some people will hear that when I say speak in truth, and they will say, well, that means that I should tell everybody the truth regardless of how bad, and not worry about how tactful I am in telling people the truth. So that you're ready to go to somebody and basically tell them whatever in the meanest way you can, and then you can fall back and say, yeah, but I told them the truth, so I'm good, right? No, speak the truth in love. Because he tells us we're supposed to love our neighbors as ourselves, right? And so we speak the truth. And there are times when you have to be harsh with somebody. I'm not saying never be harsh. But there are other times when you need to show them some grace too. And you can speak the truth in grace. But speak the truth to them. But do it in love. So first thing that Jesus tells us is that our words should be true. Speak the truth, but speak it in love. But then he goes on to the second point on your listening guide, and that is show grace instead of aggression. Show grace instead of aggression. We can see that starting in verse 38. It says, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person. But whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. And if anyone wants to sue you, take your shirt, let him have your coat also. And whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to him who asks of you, and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. For you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. All right, I'm going to stop there because the rest part of this I'm going to save for next Sunday. But Jesus next talks about our actions. Our actions. And he says that we should not be trying to harm other people. And Jesus says, you have heard, meaning he's going back to the Old Testament and he's pulling apart from the Old Testament. And he says, you have heard an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But so what is he meaning by this? Is he meaning in here that we should not retaliate at all? Meaning that if somebody does something harmful to us, that we should just let it go and don't even worry about it? Like if somebody breaks into your house, you're like, okay, that's good, no problem. No, that's not what he's talking about here. What he's dealing with here is more personal revenge and vengeance. You're going to get even with somebody. Somebody has done you wrong, and you're going to get even with them. Somebody did something to you, and you are personally going to go back and get back at them. Let's say that somebody comes in and robs your house. They break in. You find out who did it, and you say, well, I'm going to get them back. So you go to their house, and you break into their house, and you, of course, going to take all your stuff back, right? But then, while you're there, you're like, let me teach them a lesson. Let me just take some of their stuff too so they'll know how this feels. That's what he's talking about. And see, when we do that, when we step in and we try ourselves to get back at somebody, then that means that we're not allowing God to work. You realize that? When we try to get back at somebody, we're not allowing God to work. See, Jesus is saying that we should actually be more forgiving. And we should show people grace. And if at all possible, we should try not to retaliate. We should try to live as neighbors, as good neighbors, if at all possible. Paul's words in Romans chapter 12 come to mind here. Romans 12, verse 17 through 21, Paul says, do not repay evil for evil. Give careful thought to do what is honorable in everyone's eyes. If possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Friends, do not avenge yourselves. Now listen to this part. He says, do not avenge yourselves. Instead, leave room for God's wrath, because it is written, vengeance belongs to me. I will repay, says the Lord. So leave room for God to handle it instead of you stepping in and trying to get revenge and being vengeful towards somebody. But Paul goes on and says, but if your enemy is hungry, feed him. And if he is thirsty, give him something to drink. For in doing so, you will be heaping fiery coals on his head. Do not be conquered by the evil, but conquer evil with good. So Jesus is telling us that we shouldn't be vengeful. We shouldn't try to get revenge. But then he also says, let me give you some examples of what I'm talking about. And we can see that starting in verse 39. He gives us several examples here. First one, it says, but I say to you, do not resist the evil person, But whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. Now what he's talking about here is somebody has insulted you. Because we read this and say, well, that meant somebody got hit on their right side and then you turn your left. Meaning, does Jesus want me to take a punch on the right side, then turn around and take a punch on the left side? That's not what he's talking about here. What he's talking about, because he says, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn to him also the other. You have to understand, during that day and time, the right hand was the dominant hand. So if you were going to slap somebody, you were going to use your right hand. Well, if you slapped somebody, you would hit them on their left side, right? So what he's talking about is you are backhand slapping somebody on their right side. Everybody would see that as an insult. That wasn't meant to harm you as far as physically. That was meant to harm you as far as an insult so that everybody in the community could see it. And he's basically saying it's okay to take the insult on the right side and turn and take the insult on the left side. Meaning show them grace and don't come back with something just as vengeful or try to get revenge in some way that you can think of. But show grace instead of vengeance. Next he comes in verse 40. It says, if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have also your coat. So what Jesus is saying here, the shirt is basically the tunic, and then the coat is a cloak, and that was your most valuable garment that you would have. And he's basically saying if somebody has a legitimate lawsuit against you, try your best to handle it graciously. If you can settle any way you can settle it, do it graciously. If graciously means you actually have to give a little bit extra, then give a little bit extra to settle the matter if it's a legitimate thing that's happening. And show grace to the person. Because you never know what's going to happen when you're showing grace to the person, what that will do for them. But he goes on. Verse 41, and he says, whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Now what's happening here is we've all heard companies say they go the extra mile, right? Have y'all heard that before? All right, so that's coming from this verse here. What was happening was, at that point in time, the Israelites, they were under Roman rule. And so because they were under Roman rule, that meant that anytime a Roman soldier was out and he was carrying his luggage around, his armor or whatever, he could stop an Israeli citizen and say, you're going to carry my stuff for 1 mile. This mile literally means 1,000 steps, 1,000 paces, which would it was the equivalent of 1 mile. So he's basically saying you're going to carry it for 1 mile. He could, by law, do that at any point in time. So that meant as you're walking along, maybe you're going to work or maybe you're going back from a long day of work and the Roman soldier passes you, and then he says, stop, pick up my stuff, start carrying it. By law, you had to stop, pick up his stuff, and you had to start carrying it for 1 mile. Now, do you think they abused this a lot? Yeah, probably so. I mean, if they were smart, you'd get 4 Roman soldiers together and said, I don't want to carry my armor today. And so they go up to 4 people and say, carry my armor for 1 mile. Well, then as soon as they drop it after that first mile, those 4 just look at one of the other 4 and say, hey, you pick it up and carry it another mile. You could actually get 4 miles out of 4 people with ease. They probably abused this a lot. But Jesus, and see, here's the other thing. The Israelites hated this. Because every time a Roman soldier said, pick up my armor and carry it to this place or carry it to that place, that showed that they weren't the owners of their country. They wanted to have their country back. And every time they had to pick up a Roman soldier's his armor, it showed, we're in control, you're not. You belong to us because we took over your country. And it burned them up every time they picked it up. You ever had to do something that just burned you up? Every time you did it, it just made you mad? I mean, if we think about it, going to the DMV just burns everybody up, right? Because the lines are so long at the DMV. And you would rather do anything but go to the DMV, right? What if you had to do that week after week? But here, Jesus says something else. He says, if they ask you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. That means when you get to the end of that first mile and the soldiers, he's already probably looking around saying, who can I ask to go ahead and pick up my armor to take it to the next mile? And you say, I'll keep walking. I'll keep carrying this. Can you imagine his reaction? You're going, what? Are you sure about that? Why are you doing that? And see, that opened the door for them to say, well, this man Jesus, he told us that we should do this. See, I believe he's the Messiah. I believe he's come for us. And if he asked me to do this, then I'm going to do it. And then they would probably say, well, wait a minute, tell me about this Jesus guy because I want to know this guy. Well, then the same goes for us. If somebody asks us to do something, and then we just do the bare minimum, guess what? They're not going to think much of that, are they? But if we go the extra mile, and we do more than what they thought we were going to do, and then they come back and say, well, wait a minute, why'd you do that? Well, let me explain to you why I did that. Because, see, I had this relationship with Jesus. And see, he came and he lived a perfect life that I couldn't live. And I know that I've sinned. I know that I've messed up. I know that I'm broken. And he came and he lived the perfect life for me. But he didn't just do that, but he went and he died on the cross for my sins. He also died on the cross for your sins too. And see, not only that, but he was raised from the dead, which means he defeated death for me, and he defeated death for you. And see, if I put my faith in him, then that means I have that relationship with him. I have a relationship with my Creator. And this is why I'm doing it. Because he asked me to go the extra mile, because he went the extra mile for me. Imagine what somebody would think with that conversation. They would say, wait a minute, how can I get to know this guy that went an extra mile for me? So he's saying, don't just go 1 mile, but go 2 miles. Go an extra mile. But then he goes on and he says, give to him who asks of you. Do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. So Jesus is saying that if someone needs help, then that means we should step up and help them. And what he's talking about here, he's not talking about somebody who's lazy, who's just not working at all. He's talking about somebody that had a real need. And he's saying that you should help them if they have a real need. Because here's the thing, Jews back then, they would rather die than to ask for help. You know somebody like that? They would rather do whatever than ask for help. Because that's not in their DNA to ask for help. And they'll basically almost kill themselves trying to do whatever they were doing instead of just breaking down and asking for help. That was the Jews back then. They would rather die than to ask for help. And if they were asking for help, that meant they lost all hope and they were turning to whoever they could. So when that happens, don't lecture them. You just help them. Don't shame them. You just do exactly what God says. You help them. You just show them love. Love your neighbor as yourself. And see, all that leads to our bottom line. Right or wrong, people will view you and Christ by your actions. Y'all believe that? Right or wrong, that people are going to view us but also they're going to view Christ by our actions, what we say and what we do. Same was true for the early church. You realize that? As Christianity was starting up, that's same for the early church. And do you know what people said about the early church? They kept saying one thing over and over and over again, and that was that they loved each other. They would help each other out. They would do anything for anybody. They were known as people that loved each other. Imagine if they said that about us today too. The church is known for loving people. If there's a need, then they see the need, then they try to meet that need. If they give you their word, then guess what? They give you their word and they're going to do whatever they say they're going to do. They don't try to get the easy way out, but they follow through with what they say they're going to do. So let me ask you, do you speak the truth? And do you speak the truth in love? There's a difference there, because you can speak the truth, but you can also do it to hurt somebody. Do you speak the truth in love? And then the second is, do you show grace instead of aggression? Meaning, do you try to, when somebody does something wrong to you, do you cut them a break? You show them grace? Or do you think about how you can get even with them? See, if we're followers of Christ, then that means we speak the truth. Our yeses are yes and our noes are noes. But we also speak the truth in love. And the other is that we show others grace. Because we're all going to mess up, are we not? We all fall short of the glory of God. And if we show somebody grace, we never know where that'll lead. See, Christ showed us grace by coming and living the perfect life for us, did He not? Dying on the cross for us, being raised from the dead for us. Let me ask you, do you have that relationship with Him? Have you ever come to a point in your life where you've come and asked for forgiveness and put your faith and trust in Him? If not, I'll be down front. Be glad to share with you how you can have that relationship with Him. For the others of you who have that relationship, let me ask you, when you go out the doors, are you speaking in truth and in love? And are you showing grace instead of aggression in your actions? All right, let's close in prayer. Lord,